Welcome back inside Golf Talk Canada. Well, it was another amazing year for PGA Tour Canada. For a full look back on the year that was and a preview of what's to come, here's Mark with PGA Tour Canada Executive Director Scott Pritchard.
Scott, always a pleasure. Thanks for taking the time to do this with us on Golf Talk Canada as we take a look at the year back in Canadian golf and a look at the year back on PGA Tour Canada. Before we get to, the year that was, and it's an historic year as it's the final year really of what you and I grew up with as the Canadian Tour and then eventually PGA Tour Canada. But before we get there, we have a 5 now. We've handed out a Fortinet Cup. We have 5 players. They are heading to the Corn Ferry Tour. They are heading to the final stage of Q School. And one of them happens to be Canadian. So it was a nice way to put a bow on the season.
It sure was. I mean, you look at Etienne Papineau, first Quebecer to win on PGA Tour Canada, first Quebecer to have Corn Ferry Tour status in 20 years. Carl Desjardins was the last player from Quebec. Actually, he's actually from Ontario, Hawkesbury, but he is, known in Quebec circles for sure. So, and then Hayden Springer, winning twice, once in Manitoba, and then winning the Fortinet Cup. And Hayden Springer is actually, I would say, a player to watch. He actually beat Victor Hovland in college in one of his last tournaments of the year, the Big 12 championship. So certainly has pedigree and impressive player, as well as Sam Choi, who finished number 2. I think at the beginning of the season, people would ask me, who's the player to watch? And the reality is when you look at the history of PGA Tour Canada, players that have finished in the top 5, even other players that have not finished in the top 5 and have earned PGA Tour status. It's so hard to pick one player or a handful of players, but I can tell you Sam Choi, who finished second, is quite the player. He had 7 top 10s this year, as well as a victory at the Windsor Championship. He was devastated to not finish first. But I suspect he'll use that as motivation going into final stage of Q School. And who knows, now that there are 5 cards available for the PGA Tour season next year, Sam Choi potentially has the opportunity, along with the others that finished in the top 5 that get into final stage of Q School. They have the ability to potentially get a PGA Tour card and skip the Corn Ferry Tour altogether. So it'll be exciting to watch.
Is that the biggest misconception, Scotty, for people who are maybe not as familiar with PGA Tour Canada as obviously yourself or myself or Adam and Bob, people within the golf community, how close the line actually is when you say, players to watch? I mean, that is such a thin line between a guy competing week in and week out on the on PGA Tour Canada to next, within a 12-month period, all of a sudden he's a winner on the PGA Tour. Like, that is a very thin line.
Indeed. And it's happened a few times. I mean, Nick Taylor is a great example. His last season on PGA Tour Canada was 2013. His last event would have been in September around this time. And he won the Sanderson Farms championship in November of 2014. So, just over a year removed, winning on the PGA Tour. Ryan Gerard is a really good recent example, a player that played a full season up here last year. He won the Quebec Open. He Monday qualified for the Honda in West Palm Beach earlier this year. Parlayed that, he finished top 10, and he parlayed that into sponsor exemptions and eventually got special temporary membership on the PGA Tour. So he was less than a year removed from playing on PGA Tour Canada, and he's a full PGA Tour member for next season. And so I suspect, with next year in the merger of the PGA Tour Latino America and PGA Tour Canada becoming PGA Tour Americas, you're going to see that more often, because that, like our tour, in terms of PGA Tour Canada, has been super competitive, as you know. And I often say, I think it's one of the most competitive tours in the world. And now you're bringing 2 tours together, and it's going to be very competitive.
Okay, we're going to get to that. But before we get to PGA Tour Americas, which launches March 2024, before we get into some of the details of next year and what it's going to look like, taking a look back, this year, I guess this is 2 questions for you. What stands out this year, whether it's a highlight of a round of golf you saw with your own eyes, or just something that stood out about your journey across the country this year? And part two of that is, yes, there are big things ahead, but what will you miss now that the Canadian golf community closes the door on a long history of what was the Canadian Tour?
Yeah, well, great question. I think having a Canadian win the first event of the year, it's the first time that that's happened since Rob McMillan did it in 2000. So, a long time in between Canadians winning the kickoff event in Victoria, which has been the longest standing event on the Canadian Tour, PGA Tour Canada. I mean, it dates back to the early 80s. And the same people that started the event are involved. A gentleman by the name of Keith Degg has put his heart and soul into that event and still does. And he's in his mid 80s. So, that's really great to see. I think, I tend to keep tabs on the Canadian contingent, as I think, Stuart McDonald played on the Corn Ferry Tour last year, for the last couple of years, actually. Didn't play so well up there, so he came back down, won our event in Ottawa in pretty convincing fashion, in a playoff. And Hayden Springer winning twice. Really, if you look, he shot 22 under in Calgary at Country Hills. The next closest player was 17 under. So, very convincing fashion. Really kind of soft-spoken guy from Tennessee, but I expect, I will say he does all his talking on the golf course. Again, it's been a really, really good season, returning to Windsor for the Windsor Championship. Adam Wagner, who's our tournament director down there, did a fantastic job, along with Marty Comsa, who's their tournament chair. I mean, there's a whole list of people that are behind the scenes on PGA Tour Canada, our partners that help run these events in these communities across Canada, who make impact across the board. I mean, I look at Ottawa, Soldier On, $100,000 was raised for Soldier On. TPC Toronto, our event up there, Osprey Valley Open, raised over $250,000 for local charity in Caledon. So those kind of things, are super important to us as an organization, to see the impact that it makes in the community and the money that comes to it, via charity, but also through the economic impact. So yeah, all in all, it's been a great year. It was a great culminating event in Calgary, and now we're looking forward to next year.
All right, next year, March 24, PGA Tour Americas kicks off. It will end very similar. Labor Day here in Canada. So the North American leg of this is going to look a lot similar. So although we close the door on PGA Tour Canada and the Canadian Tour, we open up a very big door that should be really good for the game, great for players, and just makes that vertical ability to get to the next level. I want to say easier, but easier on the player in terms of, where am I going to play? What's my schedule look like? Those types of things are important to these developing players. And again, the Canadian part of this is not going away.
Yes. So there'll be 16 events on PGA Tour Americas, 6 in Latin America, 9 in Canada, and 1 in the United States, which would be our event, the CRMC Championship in Minnesota. So players will gain status via the top 60 finish this year, but also through PGA Tour Finals Q School. So the top 5 in ties, as I mentioned earlier, will go to the PGA Tour. 6 through 40 will have Corn Ferry Tour status, and then 41 up to a certain number hasn't been established at this point, will have status on PGA Tour Americas for the first 6 events. So there'll be sort of the Latin swing, and then you'll move over to the North American swing. So we're super excited about it. Our intention is to announce the PGA Tour Americas schedule in the next few weeks, looking into October, which is earlier than we ever have. But that talks to the excitement and the commitment that our partners have across both Latin America and up here. And we couldn't be more excited to get that news out, and also talk a little bit about eligibility. You mentioned call it meteoric rise of a few that have happened, but I suspect we'll see that more. And the top 10 finishers on the Fortinet Cup points list at the end of the season next year will earn full Corn Ferry Tour status, which is better than what we've had ever in the past. And so, like you said, that's going to give the players the ability to set their schedule, really give them peace of mind so they can focus on the task at hand, which is ultimately for them to get to the PGA Tour.
Scott, you and your team did just an incredible job. I mean, you really brought the glory days of the Canadian Tour back in the last few years of PGA Tour Canada. So, I've told you time and time again, we think you and the team did an exceptional job. We can't wait to see what you do next with PGA Tour Americas, and we'll keep our eye on October. We'll stay in touch when you make that announcement, and we'll get that schedule out and on Golf Talk Canada. So thanks for taking the time. Congratulations again on an amazing year, and we're looking forward to 24.
Thanks, Mark. We appreciate your support as always.